Good evening, one and all. We're very happy to open this BIBLIOTOPIA Festival for 2021, and we're especially happy, given the current circumstances, to be able to hold it. This year, BIBLIOTOPIA's theme is change. So Amin Maalouf, we're going to be talking about change, change that we wait for, change that happens, change that we might imagine. You are, without doubt, a writer who has thought a lot about change. But before I introduce you and begin our discussion, the opening discussion of BIBLIOTOPIA, about which we're very pleased, I'd like to tell you a bit about how this festival is going to unfold. It will be taking place online and live on the Foundation's website. The audience here in the hall can ask questions. Those joining us online can also ask questions either directly during the event by sending a written message by WhatsApp to 4179 926 4251. Before or during the meeting, you can send an email to communication@fondation.ch, and all of the books are on sale in our bookshop. So the festival is online, but all of the sessions will be available online throughout the festival. We'll be speaking French here, but we have two interpreters. I would like to thank them. Alia Rahal and Star Pirot are going to be simultaneously interpreting our discussion into English. So, Amin Maalouf, thank you for coming. We're particularly happy to have you here because we know that getting here was not easy. You're a writer. You won the Prix Goncourt. You're an essayist. You're a member of the Académie française. You're a true humanistic and cosmopolitan thinker about yesterday's, today's, and maybe tomorrow's world. And Hope and in Apprehension, Reinventing Society. That's the title of our session. And the Rock of Tanios in 1993 won you the Goncourt Prize, and then you wrote your latest book, Les Frères Inattendus. And you have plunged us into the Middle East, the West, the changing world, its history, its adventures, to put us right at the meeting point, the historical and cultural meeting point between cultures, languages, and people. And to say a few words about your work, I think we can name a few places. Lebanon, to start with. You were born there. It's also a country of mountains, which are often featured in your books. You had to leave your country in the 70s because of the Civil War. And this is a recurrent theme in many of your books. The Rock of Tanios, Ports of Call, your autobiographical account, and the Arab world is broadly present in your work. Omar Khayyam is one of your major influences, and you've written about Omar Khayyam. And you continue to be an observer of Lebanon, even if you don't live there any longer. And you have talked about it at length in your book, Adrift, How Our World Lost Its Way, which has connections to the Nos Frères Inattendus. You talk about the situation in the Arab world and whether or not it's a precursor for a broader crisis. Nos Frères Inattendus is a novel of crisis also, in a way. In France is where you live. You were elected to the Académie française. You replaced Claude Lévi-Strauss. You've worked for the European Union and the European Commission, and I know that the European Union has led to a lot of questions for you. And l'Île Dieu, the island of Dieu, which is a very special place to you, which is a place where you're similar to where your narrator Alec lives. It's called Antioch, a fictitious island, but I think it resembles l'Île Dieu quite closely. You situate it off Canada. Perhaps you can tell us why. Well, Alec lives in solitude, which is chosen, until there's a major blackout. All technology comes to a halt, the world comes to a standstill, and through the collapse of the world that Alec follows from his island with his neighbor Eve, who's a writer and is going to take on an important role in his life, but also through other characters, Agamemnon, who's going to play a key role in the book. They go through the crisis and discover what's happening in the world, and we'll talk about that later. But there's not only is there a huge threat to the world, but also the arrival of a group of people called the Friends of Empedocles. They are a form of superior human beings, an elite race of supermen who are going to bring progress and redemption to the world, but perhaps also a type of threat. So to begin with, I'd like to ask you to read a passage from Nos Frères Inattendus, our unexpected brothers, literally, which gives us an indication of the humanistic and philosophical aspects of the book. Yes, to situate the passage, well, first of all, thank you for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak at Bibliotopia. As you said, I often alternate between novels and essays, and sometimes I write them nearly simultaneously. In the same state of mind, I'll be writing an essay, and at the same time, I'll be working on a novel, or a novel is springing out of this state of mind that I'm in. And I would say that here again, this was true, because Adrift, How Our World Lost Its Way, and Nos Frères Inattendus sprang out of the same concerns. Adrift describes a world which is sick, perhaps about to sink, and I do believe this quite firmly is happening today. At the same time, perhaps it's a way of assuaging my own fears about the end of the world. I started to think over, and it took years for this book to ripen. I started to think about how we could imagine a different world, a world that would be transformed, recomposed by these unexpected brothers. Who are the unexpected brothers? In the novel, they are the refugees of the Athenian miracle, a group of people who experienced this incredible moment in the world's history, where over a couple of decades, theater, philosophy, democracy, historiography were invented, not to mention others. And I imagined that this period, which was very short, lasted less than a century, left traces. And these people are the heirs of this miracle, and they arrive in our world, and they're totally unexpected. We didn't realize they existed, and all of a sudden we see a different kind of humanity, a different kind of humankind, which is full of possibilities. So let me read this short passage that you chose. And so humankind would be twofold. The world would be the theater of two simultaneous plays, one visible and the other invisible, one typified by a lack of consciousness, and that is our history, the other full of wisdom and salvation, but also, for my people, full of debasement. Should I, like my novelist neighbor, celebrate with champagne, or should I perhaps be wearing mourning? And the question is a legitimate one. If one day we had the chance or the unfortunate occurrence of meeting with an elite group. They're not necessarily more powerful, but they are morally superior to us. What would our world be? Our world would be like a draft copy of creation. And that is the fear of the narrator, Alec. He thinks, well, everything that we've worked so hard for, everything that we've created is going to be marginalized and reduced to nothing by the appearance of something which is highly superior to us, including in the field of medicine. Yes, because the friends of Empedocles reveal their powers little by little, including their healing powers. And we see clearly that this is a fable. It's a philosophical fable. It's an apocalyptic fable, at least at the beginning. Could we say that this is your version of Candide? Well, the inspiration certainly comes from these philosophical fables, be they those of Voltaire or others. I think we were all fed at the breast of these philosophical fables in our youth. The idea at the heart of this fable is, and one of the characters explains it, he says, one day Newton discovered the theory of universal attraction when he saw an apple fall from a tree. He discovered it at the end of the 17th century. But the theory wasn't created in the 17th century. It's existed forever. He discovered it because he was ready to discover it. It was ready to be discovered. So it's highly possible that humankind might discover things at other times, other eras. The rhythm of discovery and progress, the pace of these things in human civilization is not just due to progress. There could be another kind of rhythm. I have to say that I have a deep-seated concern related to this deep chasm between the material evolution of humankind and its moral evolution. This is probably, I would say, the biggest issue in our era. We have made incredible progress, and that's great. I am a fan of progress. I'm very interested in progress, either in IT, in medicine, or any other field, except that our mentalities haven't kept up. The situation is not to the solution is not to slow down progress. We can't uninvent things. But what we need to do is accelerate the evolution of our mentalities. We have to bring our mentalities up to the level of the technical, scientific, and material progress that we've achieved so far. As I've already said, Alec has decided to live on this island, live alone. It was a choice. He didn't have to do it. He is therefore outside of the world. Is this a point of view that you've adopted as well? I have to confess that this book is something that I worked on in a similar environment to the one that Alec lives in. We spent a lot of time on a small island off the Atlantic coast of France. It's not as small as the island in the novel. That island is tiny, and there are only 2 inhabitants, so that's not the way our island is. But I love islands. I love the Atlantic islands. I feel at home there. And it was only natural for me to set my novel in this kind of environment. So one day, Alec decides to up sticks and go to live on this island. He's a press cartoonist. You know those comic strips that we used to see or might still see in some newspapers? And he thought, why should I stay in Montreal? I'd like to live a life the life that I aspire to, and I can send my cartoons in over the internet. He likes solitude. I'm a bit like that too. And he decides to go live on this island. His father had bought part of this island 2 years before. So he sets up house on this island, and after a few years, somebody else buys another part of the island, and it's this novelist called Yves Saint-Gilles, and they have no contact whatsoever, and they don't really like each other. What brings them together is the event that occurs. One day, all communications come to a halt. And due to preceding events, he is sure that there's been a nuclear war or attack and that the world is ending, and that the radioactive cloud is coming to the island. So he thinks that he only has a short time left to live. And his neighbor feels the same way. She says, humans are crazy. They've played around with weapons for so long that they ended up starting a war. So they both are convinced that there's been a nuclear war, and little by little they start to realize that that is not what is happening, that a war did nearly break out, but somebody intervened and kept both sides from launching their missiles and thus avoiding the war. But what you describe in the book, and you describe it very well, is the way that everything comes to a dead standstill because there's a total blackout and the sense of vulnerability that the characters and everyone around them feel. This feeling of vulnerability is something that we all know about since about a year ago. Yes, well, it's a bit strange because, as I've already said, I had already finished the book before 2020 started, and I had my editor read it, my publisher read it, and we were planning to publish it to let a bit of time go by after Adrift was published, and then the pandemic broke out. This is a book which talks about an event which strikes the entire world. Nobody can talk about anything else. And in this event, health and medicine become the predominant dimensions in people's lives. Myself and my publisher obviously wanted to publish the book because without realizing it at the time, I had written about something that was actually happening. In a state of mind, and I described a state of mind that was very close to what we all felt when the COVID crisis struck. Everything comes to a halt. Nobody talks about anything else. Nobody is worried about world news anymore. Everything to do with the death and disease becomes obsessive for everyone. The omnipotence of the medical field, medical practitioners who have greater knowledge than the rest of us. So all of this prompted me to publish the book. But the book was already written before the crisis broke out. Alec, or even Eve, this writer who becomes very important to him, these are very disenchanted people at the beginning of the novel. Eve wrote a book entitled The Future No Longer Lives at This Address. This is a form of disenchantment that we might also feel when we read Adrift. Is this something that you feel? Yes, I think I'm disenchanted. I'm not desperate. I continue to believe that someday there might be a way out. And this book is a way of imagining a way out, even if it is a philosophical tale or fable. But it's true, I am disenchanted. When I look at my native country, Lebanon, I think I really wish that things hadn't turned out the way they have. When I look at what's happening in Europe, which obviously doesn't have the serious problems that there are in Lebanon, but is certainly not taking a direction I would have wished for it. I believed, and I still believe, in the European dream, and I have the impression that it's been poorly managed, that it hasn't been brought forward with enough conviction and enough wisdom. And I have to confess that I was devastated by Brexit. I think that it's a major failure for the European project. And even more broadly, in our world, there's no longer any world order. We're not even in a Cold War, but there's great tension, and war could break out. I think often about all of the things that would be needed to solve these problems. But we have the instruments at our disposal, and we're still going straight towards the wall. So I am disenchanted, and the title of the book, the preceding book, Adrift, How Our World Lost Its Way, I think spells that out quite clearly. But, so there is hope in Les Frères Attendus, Demosthenes, Pausanias, Agamemnon. They are disciples of Empedocles and the Greek miracle. Why Empedocles? Well, why the Greek miracle, you could ask? There's one very simple reason. When the Greek miracle blossomed, it was totally unexpected. It was not the product of a long evolution such that it was a natural occurrence. It sprang out of nothing in a world which was not ready for something so sophisticated and advanced. Well, nothing springs out of nothing. Obviously, there must have been an underlying evolution that enabled the blossoming of the Greek miracle. But I've always been fascinated by the fact that humanity can sometimes, quite suddenly and unexpectedly, produce a miracle. So it is a miracle, and it's no chance that all historians talk about it as a miracle. It is, in a certain way, a real miracle. So why Empedocles? Empedocles is a character I've always been fascinated by. Empedocles did exist in ancient Greece, and he's a bit of a legendary figure. He lived in Sicily. He died in very strange circumstances. Etna was erupting. He walked up to the crater and was never seen again. We don't know if he accidentally fell in, if he jumped in or threw himself in, but his disappearance gave rise to a myth about him. And when you read the fragments of his texts that have been found, they're fascinating. 2.5 millennia ago, he wrote very sophisticated things, and with in a very poetical voice. It's a mixture of poetry and scientific vision. And what I discovered when I was doing research for my book was that he was a forerunner. He was like in the book, the appearance of a population or a nation that would be more advanced than the rest and would be a savior for the rest of humankind. You use words like savior, and use the word miracle increasingly throughout the book. So there's a messianic aspect to the book. Can we see the Friends of Empedocles as apostles? Is that something that you could, something that you could have crossed your mind? I think there are people who see a miracle happening and see these people as saviors. Yves de Saint-Gilles, the novelist neighbor of Alec, is one of them. But the narrator doesn't share her opinion. His view is more, I would say, down to earth, more secular. He sees them as an evolution of one branch of humankind. And I think perhaps that's a vision that I can more easily embrace. The idea that a group of humans, for whatever reason, developed a higher moral sense than the others and was able at a point in time to pull us out of the morass that our civilization has become stuck in. Because once again, I think that our civilizations are in an impasse. And then there's also the idea that in history there have been moments where civilizations were fragile. I often mention the 15th century Mexican society in the book, meeting with a more developed society that annihilates their society. And I can't help wondering what would happen if our society came into contact with a society that was, for us, what Cortés was to Montezuma. Yes, you write that civilization, after the intervention of the Friends of Empedocles, became suddenly obsolete. Even for the Aztecs, the shock was not as sharp and brutal. So once again, it's difficult not to think about the pandemic. I think that we all felt, at least at the beginning, that all our certainties had fallen by the wayside. Yes, absolutely, and particularly in the West, particularly in the Western world. For once, the Western world saw that it wasn't managing as well as other civilizations. That was the impression we got. I don't know if the future will confirm this, that the Confucian world was managing the crisis better than the Western world, which is extremely rare in the history of over the last 500 years of our history. So perhaps something is changing in the balance between civilizations, in the equilibrium. This is an idea which is in the book, but it's not only in the book, it's something that has been working on me for quite some time. In the country I grew up in and in the West, we tend to see the Western civilization as being superior, more effective and more efficient, and all of a sudden, nowadays, we're wondering if Western civilization will still be the predominant civilization for centuries to come, or whether it's not about to be replaced by another. It's too early to say, but what is sure is that something very fundamental is happening today in that respect. You you do point this possibility out. But for what world was the shock brutal and sharp? Of course, it was sharper for the Western world, because you have to feel superior to feel that kind of defeat. You've written at length about Lebanon and about different worlds and cultures. Is this also the defeat of the Western perspective that you are describing here on Amin Adrift?
I think all civilizations today are experiencing a crisis. It is the case of the civilization in my area, my region of origin, unprecedented crisis in its history, and the Western civilization, which is also experiencing a very serious crisis, not only in the power balance. I don't know whether you think the same way as I do, but our societies are being permeated by debates and ideologies which challenge a certain number of things. I'm not controversial in nature. I'm not one to say those who think this or that are racists, they're xenophobes, but there are real problems in our societies that we are unable to solve. There are phenomena that we have a hard time dealing with. We have failed in the main task of each society and globally, which is to get the different communities of people to live together. We're all in the same agora, but we have a hard time living together. We are close together, and this increases distrust and violence. We're experiencing a period which is marred by very serious problems in our societies. And what strikes me is the fact that we don't have any solutions that we can implement. We have different attitudes, and just look at climate change, for instance. We speak about it and speak about it again and again and again, and we pretend, but in actual fact, we don't really do anything against climate change. Speaking about coexistence of different communities, we accuse each other, but can we manage to have people live harmoniously even in the most advanced societies? Obviously, the answer is no. So we're experiencing a deep crisis in our societies. Once in a while, it's true that we'd like someone to come in and find a solution. Maybe not a savior per se, maybe not a Superman, but we'd like something to come from within, something that's authentic, that is humanistic in our species' experience. Now, we could read your fable in a literal way, and there's what happens at the end. Empedocles' friends manage to heal part of the population. They come in different parts of the world, and they heal people. It's a little bit what's happening with the vaccine right now, isn't it? There's this vaccine, we want to heal everybody, heal all the peoples. Doesn't this prove that the friends of Empedocles, the hope you have in knowledge, in enlightenment, in humanism, enlightened humanism, isn't that at the heart of these civilizations whose sinking you are announcing? I think that health, medicine, which has been predominant in our concerns these past 12 months or so will stick with us for a long time, maybe forever. I think that concerns around disease, around life expectancy, this is a concern that is going to become critical for all human societies for a long time to come. Obviously, the vaccine is today's concern. Tomorrow it may be replaced by another kind of concern. But medicine and health is at the heart of everything, and it'll stay with us for a long time. It's very interesting because in this book there are two very different points of view. There's Eve and there's the narrator. Eve observes what's happening in the world, and that's the narrator, and Eve is almost happy. She sees the society she lives in as a patriarchic society that deserves its fate, and maybe a new civilization would be fairer can come out of this ordeal. Do you think that part of humanity does want the Western civilization to sink? I don't think it's something that they wish, but Eve's reaction is the reaction of someone who no longer trusts human civilization, not necessarily just Western civilization, because she judges other civilizations even harsher than the Western civilization. I think that there are a lot of people all around the world who want things to change. They want to turn the table upside down because it hasn't been set properly. They feel that the world needs to be turned topsy-turvy. They don't know where this will lead to. It's always a little difficult to say that you want everything to be turned upside down. In history, when such things happen, they sometimes led to the worst. But sometimes we do want a wind of change to blow on our civilizations. We do want change. You spoke about change at the beginning. I think we're at a time when we feel that the world is starting to change, it's starting to be transformed. We don't know where it's going to. We don't really trust the current evolution. It's both very concerning and fascinating to observe this. When I introduced you, I spoke about humanism. I spoke about your cosmopolitan vision of things. These are things that we find in all of your works. Do you think these ideas are still relevant? I think we don't really have a choice. I think we need to revive values such as universalism, even though these values have been weakened, as we've seen. We see nationalism increasing, and you actually wrote a book about this, announcing this, didn't you? Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, things have taken a turn for the worst. This was in my book, In the Name of Identity. Unfortunately, things have not gotten better. There's a turn towards nationalism everywhere in the world. I hope we will change our vision of things, but that's not how the world is evolving right now. What we're seeing in many societies around the world, India, the US, and the Arab world, as well as in Europe, we constantly see people becoming more intolerant, being more radical.
Cette évolution n'a pas encore, ne s'est pas arrêtée encore.
And I don't think this phenomenon has yet ceased. I do hope we'll be able to change this at one point. But the short term is very concerning in this respect. I guess it's your experience of Lebanon which makes you see the danger in these identities. Well, I guess the fact that I grew up in Lebanon, a country that's split in several communities that have tried living together, haven't really managed to live together.
Ça donne un désir de voir comment les choses se passent.
I guess this experience makes me want to see how things go elsewhere. That's always been my compass. Looking, observing societies I lived in, or that I was able to get acquainted with through visits or through my reading. I always wondered how communities manage to live together. Someone from a minority, did someone from a minority feel like a full-fledged citizen? Are there prejudices preventing people from leading a normal life? Is there discrimination, visible or invisible discrimination? And I have to say that I get the feeling that there's even more discrimination than before. There are a lot of countries where people have to belong to a given religious or ethnic community to be able to be considered as a full-fledged citizen. And usually this isn't even enough to be considered as a full-fledged citizen. And this is something that I've seen in many different countries. Unfortunately, we don't currently have a vision of the world that enables us to build something like the social contract, Rousseau's social contract. We should have a contract that tells each and every single citizen, whether he was born in the country or elsewhere, but a contract that tells each citizen what are the elements that enable us to live together, what we should highlight, what we should sideline, what are the compromises that need to be done, what is the place for each culture, for each language. I get the feeling that we need to learn to live together, and this is not happening in almost all human societies. We speak about it time and time again. We draw attention on these issues. We write essays and novels about this, and yet I don't get the feeling that things are improving, at least not for the past decades or so. There's a debate between two members of the Friends of Empedocles, between Agamemnon and Pausanias. It's a very profound debate. They have a hard time finding a solution and finding common ground. It has to do with the healing of the sick and more generally about their intervention. Pausanias wants to intervene. He wants to heal the sick. He wants to offer humankind immortality to a certain degree. Agamemnon says no. He doesn't agree. He says no, we shouldn't intervene. Humankind should follow its course, even if this means destruction in the end. Why this debate? Well, it's always hard for an author to say why a given character defends a given stance. I can answer more generally. Very often, these are questions and dilemma that are the author's own and that are reflected in his character's discussions. There are things that transpire all along the novel and all along my other novels that reflect my hidden concerns, concerns that I don't necessarily want to mention as they are, but that are taken up by my various characters. I think literature is there to do exactly that. Absolutely. There's a word that comes back time and time again in your novel, which is miracle. And there is hope, hope that gets bigger all along the novel. And we can say that there is indeed hope for the narrator, but there is also hope for humankind through the character of the American president.
Vous avez raison de parler de raison, parce que je pense que on a
You're right in
besoin
saying
de croire
so.
au triomphe de la raison.
We need to believe in the triumph of reason.
Trop souvent, on a des actes qui sont dictés par
More
la
often
déraison.
than
Trop
not,
souvent,
there are actions
l'évolution
that
du
are
monde,
unreasonable. We explain the evolution of the world
des éléments qui excluent la raison, qui
by
marginalisent la
elements
raison.
that
Moi,
exclude reason, that marginalize reason.
il faut que la
I
raison
tend to
triomphe.
believe
La raison, ça
that
veut pas dire
reason needs
forcément
to
le
triumph.
mais la raison,
And there I'm not speaking about rationalism. I'm speaking about reason, wisdom that should be society's
c'est pourquoi
guiding light.
Généralement, quand je mets le mot miracle, il est
When I use the word miracle, it's usually in inverted commas. It's the miracle of reason? Yes. I think the time has now come to move on to the Q&A. Before I turn to WhatsApp, I'd like to turn to the floor to see whether one of our guests has a question to put to Amin Maalouf. There is one. Good evening. A while ago, you spoke about the gap between our technological level and our lack of wisdom. What do you think about the way we can advance morally? You spoke about wisdom.
Je crois qu'il
Well,
est normal quand l'évolution technologique, scientifique
when
s'accélère,
technological and scientific progress accelerates, it's normal that we sometimes have a hard time to keep up.
qui est inévitable.
In a sense, it's inevitable.
Ma conviction, c'est que la seule
I
manière
firmly believe
de
that
faire avancer,
the
c'est à
only
travers
way to
l'enseignement.
progress is through
Je
teaching
crois
and through
que
culture.
on ne le fait pas suffisamment.
It's not something that's done enough.
On a besoin d'expliquer.
We
Quand on a un
need to
nouvel
explain.
instrument entre les mains,
New
emploie-
instrument, a new tool
on a rarement
between your
de mode
hands.
d'emploi.
You have the user's guide, but there are no ethical explanations as to how to use it.
Et nous avons constamment des inventions.
And
que ce soit des
we constantly
instruments au
have
sens
new
matériel,
inventions, be they
ou des institutions,
material
ou des
instruments,
sociaux.
institutions, social
À aucun
media.
moment, nous n'estimons
At no point in
qu'on a
time
besoin d'un apprentissage réel.
do we
Et nous ne
think
saurions
that
pas
we need
comment faire
to
cela.
learn how to use these tools,
Tous les jours,
when in
il y a de
actual
nouvelles
fact,
réalités qu'on jette.
there are new realities being thrown to people every day, and just make do with them.
Il n'y a pas de solution miracle.
I don't think there's a miracle solution.
On
The only way to go
soit
about
attentif
this
à ces évolutions.
is to be careful with these inventions.
Comprendre, d'expliquer,
We need to understand, to explain, to think,
d'enseigner.
to teach.
Même le fait de mettre les gens ensemble au sein
even bringing people together within a single society is not going to be conducive to a spontaneous solution. Just bringing people together won't make them feel close to each other. It can make them feel close to each other, but it can drive them apart. It can lead to one or the other. We really need to proactively explain to people why they need to be living together. How to avoid things in their life in common that can come and disturb their coexistence. I think culture, literature, teaching have to be everywhere. They have to go hand in hand with any moral, technological progress in society. I have a question from WhatsApp. Good evening, Mr. Maalouf. What do you think about the rise of nationalist ideologies in Europe and Islamism in the Arab world? To me, all these ideologies put identities forward. We see what kind of challenge they're rising to meet. And I'm very sad when I observe in all societies that I know, intolerance is on the rise. Now, the reasons for this are not the same everywhere. There are fanatics. Fanatics beget fanatics. But I would say that we live in a world where identities are being affirmed. We lived in a world where the main debate was ideological in nature. It had its advantages, its disadvantages, but this is over, and we haven't been able to replace this by anything else. We are now living in a world where identities are fighting against each other, and we have a hard time making universalist ideals fight debates around identity. All our societies, even the most advanced societies, have seen this phenomenon on the rise. Once again, it's very important for intellectuals, writers, teachers, leaders, think about these issues and that they find ways of developing things. In my previous book, Adrift, How Our World Lost Its Way, I mentioned a sentence by William James who said, we need a moral equivalent to war. We need a moral equivalent to war that would enable us to mobilize, to come together without needing a war. We need a moral equivalent to the internationalism that we knew 40 to 50 years ago. We need a moral equivalent to that without having to resort to Stalinism, without having to resort to all these horrible things that we've experienced in the past. We have to to revive universalism so that it may triumph from these identities. And up till now, we haven't found it. New question about Adrift. At the end of Adrift, Europe seemed to be your last hope. Is this still the case for you today? I think Europe has a decisive role to play, and unfortunately, It
Pourquoi l'Europe?
didn't give itself the means to do
Parce
so.
qu'elle a une expérience
Why Europe? Well, Europe has experience
historique dans la relation entre ces nations.
It has experience in the relationships between its nations and its relationship with the rest of the world due to colonialism, and it made Europe mature on these issues.
D'autres puissances n'ont pas.
It's a maturity that
Et l'Europe aussi,
other
parce que
countries
c'est un
have
ensemble
not
de nations.
acquired. Europe is a group of nations that one day decided to put their wars behind them to build something together.
Il y a un monde, encore une
And
fois, menacé
the world towards which we are going, a world which is threatened by a new Cold War,
guerre froide qui risque d'être une guerre totale.
a Cold War that may become a total war. It may not be a Cold War for very long.
Principalement entre les États-Unis et la Chine.
And it is mainly going to be between the U.S. and China, with maybe Russia to a lesser extent. And I think it would destroy everything that's been built around the world. Now, who can stop this?
De raison
Who can
dans les
bring
relations internationales.
back reason in international relations? And I think the main power able to do so is Europe. Europe has this experience, this long experienced
d'égarements qu'elle a connus dans son histoire, et dont
series
elle est
of
revenue.
airings
Elle a cette
throughout its history,
possibilité d'apporter une autre vision et de
and it has the
rebâtir,
opportunity to bring a
contribuer à
new
rebâtir
vision,
un ordre
to
international qui
rebuild
fonctionne.
a new
Donc,
world
c'est pour
order
ça que
that
je
could
crois
work.
beaucoup que l'Europe doit
This is
jouer un
why
rôle
I
majeur.
believe
Et
Europe
je
has
suis
a
toujours
major
triste
role to
quand je
play,
vois qu'elle ne
and
le
I'm
joue pas
always
vraiment,
extremely
qu'elle ne se donne
sad
pas
to
les
see that
moyens
it's
de
not the
jouer.
case, that it's
Mais
not
c'est
rising
un
up to the
espoir.
challenge. I still believe very firmly in
C'est
it.
un espoir, un espoir qui n'est pas remplaçable.
It's a hope.
Dans le
No
monde
one
ne
can
peut pas
replace
remplacer
it.
ce rôle de l'Europe.
No one will replace Europe to play this role. I think Europe has to come to grips with this.
Qu'elle joue ce
It
rôle
has to
dans le monde
realize
entier.
this, and it has to play the role that the entire world is expecting from it. Good evening. You just said that Europe has to act, that it has a certain role to play, but countries are not abstract things. They're they have presidents. In 10 days, President Biden, President Putin are going to meet in Geneva. I don't know what to expect from this. I don't know what you expect from this. And what do you think of our leaders on which we depend, really, in a sense?
Je pense qu'il est important que la phase qui vient ne soit pas une phase
I think it's important for the
de conflit
upcoming
à outrance.
phase not be a phase with outright conflicts. Unfortunately, I think we are going this direction.
Si le nouveau président américain, Biden,
If
arrive
the new American president, Joe
à établir
Biden,
des relations
is able
de travail
to build
plus harmonisées avec
a more harmonious working relationship to Russia, then that could help.
On n'a pas le sentiment que les choses vont se
But we
régler en une réunion.
don't get the feeling that things are going to be solved, that problems are going to be solved over a single meeting. I think Kissinger said,
Qui a une grande lucidité,
Kissinger,
malgré
who's
son grand âge, il disait que
extremely experienced and
on a vu dans
is very
l'histoire
wise, he said that
aller vers une
all along history we've seen countries go towards war without wanting to go to war, but without knowing how to avoid it. And I think we're exactly in that same situation.
nous allons,
He actually thinks so,
soit les États-Unis,
be it the US, China, to a lesser extent Russia. We are going towards conflict
qu'on voudrait éviter si on
that
pose la question.
everybody wants to avoid. If we ask them, do you want to go to war? They would say, no, we don't. But in reality, we are going towards conflict without realizing how much destruction it will bring with it. I don't know whether that answers your question, really. If I may step in, There is a political character in the novel. There is the American president, this American president who's terminally ill. It happened on several occasions in the United States. He is ill, and this affects his judgment. Is this a way of telling us that your feeling is that political leaders are weakened, in a sense?
Well, you quite rightly point out that in the history of the United States, there have been presidents who've taken dubious decisions at times when they were very ill. There's the case of Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, who accepted conditions at the Versailles negotiations that he probably would have refused if he'd been in better health. He was in very poor physical health, and it wasn't publicized at the time, but now we know that he was really incapable of taking any decisions. The people, his advisors, took the decisions. To come back to the book, what happens is the President of the United States has an incurable disease, and somebody appears, somebody from the outside, and says, I can cure you. And this is a real dilemma. Imagine if in our current crisis, we were talking about Putin a minute ago, if the President of the United States was incurably ill, and Putin said, our scientists can cure you. That's a dilemma. Should he go over to the adversary to be healed or cured? If we do it, why should it just be for us? Our fellow citizens also need to be healed. So this is the dilemma in the book. And it's a dilemma which could actually occur. It could happen in real life if, in the future, one country had a medical apparatus that was much more advanced than ours. Everything is connected to now, so when there's a scientific advance in one area, it is taken up by other countries very quickly. But we've seen that some countries may make breakthroughs also before the countries, and they can save many lives, whereas in other countries we're still unable to do that. So it is a dilemma. But I wasn't really thinking of the pandemic when I wrote this. As I said, I wrote it before the pandemic. But it is a dilemma that I do think about and I'm concerned about independently of our current crisis. I have another question here. One of your big fans. Education is a solution, is the solution in the name of identity. Don't you think that today obscurantism is coming back in countries where education is widespread and of excellent quality? It's difficult to talk about, to say that obscurantism is on its way back. I think that disseminating knowledge is absolutely fundamental. The only miracle we can produce is the miracle of disseminating knowledge throughout the world. There are different kinds of obscurantism, obscurantism of ideas, which doesn't necessarily mean that people would be studying less or less educated. But I don't think we should let that put us off. I think it's absolutely critical in policy making and in our own behavior to give education and culture a high priority. It's not a miracle solution, but it's the only possible path if we want to avoid this crisis of extreme groups and people who live near one another, who live close to one another, hating each other and wanting to destroy each other. The only way to avoid that is for them to have extensive knowledge of the other's culture. Sometimes the only thing we know about people is the prejudices we have about them or superficial ideas, and we don't make the effort to get to know the other person through his or her literature, history, culture, so that we can understand what this person thinks, what they're going through. We have a lot of progress to make. And this is not something that can be solved in a short period of time. But I think it's absolutely crucial for us to throw ourselves into it wholeheartedly. Those of us who are in the cultural and literary fields have an important role to play. Thank you very much, Amin Maalouf. And we'll see you tomorrow for another session with the author Karine Silla. Thank you.